3 days ago, all it took was 1 cup of water to put a price on Elias Turner's peace. By the time the sun climbed over the dry Wyoming plain, the dust on the horizon already looked wrong. Elias saw it from the porch of his ranch house, a weather-beaten place with a sagging roof, a cracked water trough, and 40 acres of hardland that hadn't been generous in years. At first he thought it was a wind line rolling low across the prairie, the kind that blurred the distance and turned fences into shadows. Then he noticed the rhythm in it. Not wind. Not cattle. Riders. A lot of them. He narrowed his eyes against the glare and stepped down from the porch with his coffee still in hand, though he had stopped tasting it a minute ago. The morning had that strange silence Wyoming could make, the kind that felt bigger than quiet, as if the whole land were holding its breath. His old gelding in the corral lifted its head and went still. Even the loose tin on the barn roof had stopped rattling. Elias set the cup on the fence post and watched the cloud grow wider. He did not need a spyglass to know this was no handful of travelers. This was a column. This was purpose. By the time the first glint of sunlight caught on metal and bridle rings, Elias could already feel the news racing ahead of them, carried by fear from one ranch to the next, from one porch to the next, until it would reach town and turn into the same sentence in every mouth: "They're coming for him." And maybe they were. 3 days earlier, Elias Turner had done one small thing no one in this part of the territory would have called wise. He had given water to a boy he did not know. Not coin. Not shelter for a week. Not some grand act men would carve into church walls. Just water. A dented tin cup filled from a barrel he guarded like gold in late summer. Out here, water was not charity. Water was life measured by the inch. Men counted it for stock, for crops, for one more week of survival. You did not hand it away lightly, and you certainly did not hand it to a stranger when every rumor in the territory had taught people to fear the wrong face before asking the right question. But Elias had done it anyway, and now the horizon was answering back. He stood alone in the yard, boots planted in pale dirt, shirt sleeves rolled, grey beginning to show in his beard though he was not yet an old man. People in town called him lonely like it was a flaw, but loneliness had never been his problem. Solitude was cleaner than company. Company asked questions. Company remembered things. Elias preferred his horses, his fences, the creak of leather, the scrape of a shovel, the long dry evenings when the only sound was wind moving through cheatgrass. He had built a life quiet enough to hide inside. That was why the sight before him felt like judgment. The riders kept coming, their dust cloud lifting red and gold in the morning light, and Elias knew with a certainty that settled deep in his chest that whatever peace had lived on this ranch had already ended. He just did not know whether the boy had sent help, sent trouble, or brought something far more dangerous than either one. And when the first shape at the front of the column finally came into view, Elias felt his pulse slow instead of race, because sometimes the worst moment in a man's life begins not with a gunshot or a shout, but with the instant he realizes the past has found his front gate. 3 days earlier, before the dust rose on the horizon and before the whole county had a reason to speak his name, Elias Turner had woken to another dry morning and every intention of passing through it unseen. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when he was already out by the north fence line, hammer in hand, tightening loose wire where the winter winds had worked it apart. His ranch sat 12 miles outside of Medicine Bow, far enough that a man could go a week without hearing another voice if he chose, and Elias usually chose it. His land was not rich, but it was his. 40 acres of stubborn ground, one narrow creek that ran low by late summer, a barn that leaned a little farther every year, and a house built more for survival than comfort. He had one horse worth trusting, a few head of cattle thin from the season, and a well that gave him just enough water to keep everything alive if he measured every bucket carefully. That morning was hot early, the kind of heat that rose off the dirt before breakfast and made distance shimmer by noon. Elias worked in silence, pausing now and then to wipe his forehead with the back of his wrist and study the land the way other men studied ledgers. He knew every break in the fence, every patch of yellow grass, every place the soil turned powdery under a boot heel. He also knew what people said in town when they thought he could not hear them. They said Elias Turner was the kind of man who had buried too much and spoken too little. They said he had outlived his hopes and settled into routine because routine could not disappoint him. Maybe they were right. He had stopped arguing with other people's versions of him a long time ago. By mid-morning he headed back toward the house for water, walking slow beneath a sky so wide it made a man feel small even on his own land. That was when he saw movement near the trough beside the barn. At first he thought it was a stray calf nosing around the shade. Then the shape lifted and he saw it was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing unsteadily beside the barrel where Elias kept water covered with a board to keep out dust and heat. The boy's clothes were travel-worn, his face drawn with exhaustion, and there was enough dry earth on his boots and pant legs to show he had come a long way on foot. He did not reach for the barrel. He did not bolt either. He just stood there with one hand resting on the post, as if staying upright had become a decision instead of a certainty. Elias stopped where he was. In that stretch of country, strangers did not simply appear at a man's barn without bringing a question with them. The boy looked at him with dark, steady eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and careful. He did not ask for food. He did not ask for a horse. He said, "Sir, may I have some water?" Nothing in the words was dramatic, and maybe that was what unsettled Elias most. The boy did not sound frightened. He sounded polite. Educated, almost. Like he had been taught that dignity mattered even when need was standing right beside him. Elias should have asked where he came from. He should have asked who was with him, who might be following, and why a boy was crossing open country alone in this kind of heat. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. The second Elias saw the cracked lips, the dust at the corners of the boy's eyes, and the way he kept his shoulders straight through sheer will, the decision was already halfway made. Elias said nothing for a moment. He walked the rest of the way to the trough, set down his hammer, and took hold of the dipper hanging beside the barrel. The water inside was cool only by the standards of a Wyoming summer, but it was clean, and out here that meant more than comfort. He filled the dipper, then poured it carefully into a dented tin cup he kept on the shelf by the barn door. He did not hand it over right away. Instead he studied the boy one more time, measuring what kind of trouble might be standing in front of him. The child was slender, sunburned across the nose, and dusty from the trail, but there was something unusual in the way he carried himself. He did not beg with his eyes. He did not fidget. He waited with the stillness of someone who had learned patience the hard way. Elias finally held out the cup. "Drink slow," he said. "Too fast and your stomach will turn on you." The boy accepted it with both hands and nodded once. "Thank you, sir." He drank exactly as told, not greedily, not like someone who had forgotten manners in his thirst, but in measured swallows that made Elias wonder who had raised him. Most boys his age would have emptied the cup in one breath and reached for more. This one finished, lowered the cup, and waited again. Elias filled it a second time. Then a third. By the end of the third cup, color had begun to return to the boy's face. The tremor in his hand faded. He looked toward the shaded side of the barn but did not step there without permission. That, more than anything, unsettled Elias. The boy knew how to ask. For nothing he had not been offered. "You got a name?" Elias asked. "Noah," the boy said. After a pause, he added, "Noah Greyhawk." The name landed in the air between them and seemed to stay there. Elias had heard enough names in enough towns to know when one carried weight, even if he could not place exactly where he had heard this one before. Greyhawk. It sounded old. It sounded remembered. Still, he gave no sign. "You come a long way, Noah Greyhawk." The boy glanced toward the south pasture, where the land flattened into shimmering distance. "Far enough." "That is not an answer. It is the one I can give." Elias almost laughed at that, though he did not. The child had the calm of a grown man and the caution of someone who expected every question to come with consequences. Elias looked past him, scanning the open range for horse tracks, wagon marks, or any sign that others might be near. He saw none. Just heat, grass, and the pale ribbon of road miles away. "Anybody with you?" he asked. Noah lowered his gaze to the empty cup. Not now. It was not the answer of a child inventing stories. It was the answer of someone telling the truth 1 inch at a time. Elias felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that said close the gate, send the stranger on, and do not invite the world into your yard. In this territory, kindness had a way of circling back with a cost attached. A man could lose stock, sleep, reputation, or worse just by being seen on the wrong side of somebody else's feud. He knew that. Everyone did. But the boy was standing in the full glare of the day with dust on his boots and pride still intact, and there was something in that sight Elias could not walk away from. He jerked his chin toward the shade beside the barn. Sit for a minute, he said. You look like the sun has been collecting on you for 10 miles. Noah hesitated only a second before stepping into the shadow. I should not stay long, he said softly. That may be true, Elias replied, lifting the barrel lid back into place. But a man does not send a thirsty boy back into open country on an empty stomach either. And the moment he said it, Elias Turner knew he had already crossed the line between caution and responsibility, though he still had no idea how far that line would carry him. Elias went into the house and came back a minute later with a plate holding 2 biscuits, a slice of cold salt pork, and the last of the apple preserves from a jar he had opened the week before. It was not much by town standards, but on a ranch 12 miles from anywhere, it was a real meal. He set the plate on an overturned bucket near the barn wall and watched Noah study it before taking a seat on the ground. The boy did not reach immediately. He looked up first, as if waiting for permission he had not yet decided he deserved. Elias gave a small nod. Eat! Noah thanked him and did, but even hunger did not make him careless. He ate neatly, in small bites, with the kind of restraint Elias had seen only in church suppers or at the tables of people raised to mind every eye in the room. It was a strange thing to notice out here, beside a barn that smelled of hay and dust, but once Elias noticed it, he could not stop seeing it. The boy's speech was careful. His posture stayed straight even while sitting on the ground. His eyes moved over the ranch not with fear, but with attention. He took in the windmill, the fencing, the shape of the corral, the distance between the house and the well, all with one quiet sweep that felt less like curiosity and more like memory. Elias leaned a shoulder against the barn post. You ever worked stock before? Noah swallowed and wiped his fingers on a cloth Elias had tossed him. Some. That is another half answer. It is the truth. Elias let that sit. The boy was not rude. He was guarded. There was a difference, and Elias had spent enough years around men to know it. He noticed then that Noah's boots, though worn and dusty, had once been good leather. Not fancy, not polished, but well made. The stitching was tight. The soles had been repaired recently by someone skilled with their hands. His shirt had been mended too, not in the rough way trail men patch their clothes, but with small, careful stitches meant to last. None of it fit the picture of a child simply lost on the prairie. Where are your people? Elias asked at last. Noah looked out past the open pasture where the heat was beginning to rise in waves. Looking for me, I expect. Then maybe you ought to tell me why a boy being searched for is standing behind my barn. Noah was quiet long enough that Elias figured the question would go unanswered. Then the boy said, because I knew you would give me water. Elias frowned. You knew me? No, sir. Then how did you know that? Noah lowered his eyes for the first time since he had arrived. I did not know. I hoped. Something in the answer landed harder than Elias expected. Hope was a dangerous thing to hear spoken plainly. Most people dressed it up in big words or hid it behind humor. This boy offered it straight, like it cost him something. Elias glanced toward the empty road again. Still nothing moved out there except wind through grass. Yet the air around the ranch felt changed now, as if the day had shifted under his boots. Noah finished the food and set the plate aside with care. Then he looked toward Elias's horse in the corral. The gelding had been favoring his left front hoof for 2 days. Elias had noticed it but told himself the limp would work out with rest. Noah watched the horse for a moment and said, "He is putting too much weight on the right side to protect the left. If you keep him in that pen all afternoon, it will stiffen worse." Elias straightened. "You know horses?" Noah shrugged lightly. "Enough to see he should walk a little before sundown." There it was again, that same unsettling composure, that same hint that the boy had lived around things most children his age had not. Elias had met ranch hands twice Noah's age who could not ride a lame horse that quickly. He pushed off the post and studied him in full. Dusty boots. Quiet voice. Steady eyes. A child alone, yes, but not ordinary. Not even close. And for the first time since handing over that first cup of water, Elias began to feel that the real trouble here was not that Noah had arrived at his ranch. It was that someone, somewhere, would eventually come looking for exactly the kind of boy Noah Greyhawk had turned out to be. By late afternoon, the heat had turned heavy enough to press down on the whole ranch like a hand. Elias had given Noah a place in the shade, a second plate with beans warmed on the stove, and a bucket of cool water to wash the trail dust from his face, but he still had not decided what to do when evening came. A boy could not sleep in the open if night winds turned cold, and he could not exactly be marched back to town and handed over to questions Elias himself could not answer. The trouble with doing one decent thing, Elias was beginning to remember, was that it rarely stayed one thing for long. He was out by the corral checking the gelding's hoof again when he heard it, the distant clatter of wheels and the uneven beat of a tired team pulling hard over dry ground. He straightened and looked toward the road. A wagon was coming fast from the direction of town, cutting a pale ribbon of dust behind it. Noah, who had been sitting on the barn step with a tin cup in his hands, looked up at the same moment. Elias did not miss the change in the boy's face. It was not panic. It was recognition sharpened by caution. "You know who that is?" Elias asked quietly. Noah stood, setting the cup down with care. "I know the kind of man who rides in a hurry when he wants answers." That was all he said. The wagon pulled into the yard a minute later, and Wade Collins climbed down from the seat before the horses had fully stopped. Wade owned the spread east of the Turner place and made it his business to know what moved across this patch of Wyoming before anybody else did. He was broad through the shoulders, red from the sun, and always looked as if he had come prepared to disagree with something. His eyes went first to Elias, then to Noah standing under the eave of the barn. The expression on Wade's face tightened at once. "So it is true," he said. "Folks in town said you took in a boy off the trail, and I told them Elias Turner knew better than to invite trouble to supper." Elias kept his voice even. "You drove 12 miles to count guests on my property." Wade ignored that. He stepped closer, lowering his voice the way men do when they want words to sound heavier. "Sheriff Roy Mercer has been asking questions since noon. Says there was a child seen south of Dry Creek headed this direction. Says the boy matters." Noah did not move. He stood quiet and watchful, one hand resting at his side, his face unreadable. Wade glanced at him and then back to Elias. "You need to send him off before dark." Elias said, "He is a thirsty kid, not a horse thief. You do not know what he is. And neither do you." Wade let out a breath through his nose and looked toward the road as if he expected someone else to appear any minute. "You have been out here too long, Eli. Town hears things. There is talk about stolen papers, about men riding from the reservation line, about Mercer trying to head off some kind of dispute before it turns into something bigger. And now folks are saying a native boy disappeared in this direction, and the next thing anybody knows, he is on your ranch eating your food." Elias did not like the sound of any of it, but he liked the sound of fear passing for certainty even less. Folks in town say a lot when they are bored. This is not boredom. Wade took one more step closer. Mercer is not simply looking for a lost child. He is stirred up, and when Roy Mercer gets stirred up, he starts making everybody else nervous too. That man can turn a rumor into law if enough people are afraid. At the mention of the sheriff, Noah's gaze shifted, just slightly, but Elias caught it. There it was again, that same sign he had seen when the wagon first rolled in. The boy knew the name. Maybe not personally, but well enough for it to mean something. Elias folded his arms. Did Mercer say why he wants the boy? Wade hesitated, and in that hesitation Elias heard more truth than in any quick answer. No, Wade admitted. But he says the matter reaches farther than one ranch or one county road. He says if that boy is here, then by morning this place may have visitors you do not want. The wind stirred dust around their boots. Somewhere in the barn, a loose chain knocked softly against wood. Elias looked from Wade to Noah and back again. The warning had arrived in plain words now, carried by a man who usually enjoyed gossip but did not enjoy being frightened. And for the first time that day, Elias felt the full weight of what he had done. 1 cup of water had already become a meal, a secret, and a sheriff's interest. By sundown, it might become something none of them were ready for. Wade Collins did not stay long after that. He climbed back onto his wagon with the uneasy look of a man who had delivered a warning he hoped would prove unnecessary, then turned his team toward town and left Elias standing in a yard that no longer felt like his alone. The dust from the wagon wheels had not even settled before the ranch seemed to go strangely still. Evening lowered itself slowly across the land, softening the hard edges of fence posts and turning the far hills blue with distance, but the quiet that came with it was not peaceful. It felt watchful. Elias moved through his chores with the measured habits of a man trying to keep his hands busy while his thoughts turned restless. He checked the stock, set fresh water by the trough, and latched the chicken coop even though coyotes had not come close in weeks. Every ordinary task felt newly important, as if routine itself might hold back whatever was beginning to gather around his property. Noah stayed near the house, speaking only when spoken to, but he watched everything. He noticed Elias carrying extra water from the well. He noticed the way Elias paused at the porch steps to look toward the road. He noticed, too, that the older man set a second lantern on the kitchen table before supper without commenting on it. Inside, the house held the faint smell of coffee grounds, dry wood, and the beef stew Elias had stretched thin with potatoes and onions. They ate in near silence. Noah kept his eyes mostly on his plate, but once or twice Elias caught him listening toward the window as though the night itself had a voice he was trying to understand. After the meal, Elias leaned back in his chair and finally said, "You heard what Wade said?" Noah nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then, you know more than you have told me." The boy did not answer at first. The lamplight touched one side of his face and left the other in shadow, making him look younger and older at the same time. "I know enough to say this," Noah said at last. "If Sheriff Mercer comes here, he will not come because he cares whether I am safe." Elias studied him. That is a strong thing for a boy to be sure of. Some things become clear faster than they should. There was no self-pity in the words, only fact. Elias looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of wire, reins, and tools, and felt a weight settle deeper in his chest. He had not wanted a mystery at his table. He had wanted a quiet life and a dry season that did not finish off what little he had left. Yet here he was, sitting across from a child who spoke like a man guarding something larger than himself. "You running from Mercer?" Elias asked. Noah met his gaze. "I am trying to stay ahead of him." Elias let out a slow breath. Outside, darkness had thickened across the ranch. The wind had dropped, leaving the night so still that every small sound carried. The creak of the porch boards. The shifting hoof of the gelding in the corral. Then, sometime after the lamps were turned low and Noah had been given a blanket on the settee near the stove, another sound reached the house. The dog next door on the Collins place started barking first, sharp and uncertain. A moment later Elias heard his own horse toss its head in the corral and stamp against the dirt. He rose from bed without lighting a lamp and crossed to the window. At first he saw nothing except moonlight on the fence line and the pale sweep of open land. Then he caught it, movement where no movement should have been. A shadow passing beyond the barn. Not a coyote. Too tall. Too deliberate. Elias stood very still, listening as the horse shifted again and the loose chain by the tack room gave a faint metallic tap. Behind him, from the settee, Noah's quiet voice came through the dark. "They found us sooner than I hoped." And in that moment Elias understood that whatever had started with a single cup of water was no longer waiting for morning. Elias did not move away from the window. He kept one hand on the frame and watched the pale yard beyond the glass, letting his eyes adjust to the moonlight until shapes sharpened and the land separated itself from shadow. The barn stood quiet. The fence posts cast long silver lines across the dirt. For a few seconds, everything looked ordinary again, and that almost troubled him more than what he had seen. Trouble rarely announced itself twice. Behind him, Noah had already pushed himself up from the settee, blanket falling to his knees, face alert in the dim room. He did not look like a child pulled suddenly from sleep. He looked like someone who had been resting lightly for hours, prepared for the sound that finally came. Elias lifted a hand without turning. "Stay where you are." Noah obeyed, but only in body. His eyes remained fixed on the window, and Elias could feel the question in the room even before the boy asked it. "Do you think it is Mercer?" Elias answered carefully. "I think if Mercer wanted to make a point, he would knock on the front door with half the county watching." Noah lowered his voice. "Then it is someone else." Elias did not say what he was beginning to suspect, that whoever had crossed behind the barn did not want witnesses or conversation. He stepped away from the window and reached for the lantern on the table, then stopped himself. Light would only turn the house into a target if eyes were out there looking in. Instead, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch with the night air cool against his face. The ranch spread before him in a wash of moonlit gray. The sagebrush looked almost white. The dry ground held the day's heat in patches. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and went silent. Elias listened. He heard the soft scrape of his gelding shifting in the corral and the faint rustle of wind moving through the grass. Nothing else. He walked down the porch steps slowly, each board giving a familiar creak behind him, and crossed the yard toward the barn. Years of living alone had taught him how to move quietly when quiet mattered. Near the corner of the tack room he stopped and crouched, studying the dirt. There, clear in the thin dust, was the mark of a boot heel near the wall. Fresh. Not his. Too narrow for Wade Collins, too deliberate for any wandering hand, and placed exactly where a man might stand if he wanted a view of both the back door and the corral. Elias rose and looked past the barn toward the open dark. Whoever had come close had already gone. Or else they were patient enough to remain invisible. When he stepped back inside, Noah was waiting near the stove, shoulders square despite the hour. "You found something," the boy said. Elias nodded once. "A visitor." Noah looked down for a moment, then reached beneath the collar of his shirt and pulled free a small object tied on a leather cord. In the low light Elias could just make out a carved piece of bone or antler, polished smooth from handling, marked with a pattern too fine to be accidental. Noah closed his fingers around it as if the motion were instinct more than choice. "I should leave before dawn," he said quietly. "If I stay, more people may come." Elias looked at him, at the object in his hand, at the face that still carried youth but not innocence. He thought of the empty road, of Wade Collins's warning, of Sheriff Mercer asking questions that did not sound like concern. He thought of the boot print by his barn and the way the boy had said "They found us, not me." And something in that choice of words settled the matter. Elias Turner had spent years avoiding other people's storms, keeping his land, his thoughts, and his losses fenced off from the rest of the world. But there was a line a man crossed when someone vulnerable stepped into his yard and trusted him enough to ask for water. After that, sending him into the dark was not caution. It was surrender. Elias took a slow breath and pointed toward the settee. "You are not leaving tonight." Noah looked up, startled for the first time since he had arrived. "Sir, you do not know what that may cost you." "Maybe not," Elias said. "But I know exactly what it would cost me to put a boy back on the trail with strangers circling the barn." He moved to the window once more, scanning the quiet yard beyond it. "So here is how it stands. You sleep a few more hours. At first light, you tell me enough truth for me to decide what comes next. Until then, this house is yours as much as mine." Noah said nothing right away. He just stared at Elias with an expression too old for his years, part gratitude, part disbelief, and something else buried deeper, something that looked almost like grief. Then he gave one small nod and sat back down. Outside, the night held its silence, but it no longer felt empty. It felt as if the land itself were waiting to see what kind of man Elias Turner would be when daylight came. Dawn came pale and windless, spilling a weak gold light across the ranch as if the day itself had not yet decided what kind of trouble it meant to reveal. Elias had not slept more than an hour at a time. He spent the last stretch of darkness in a chair by the window, hat on his knee, watching the yard and listening for hoofbeats, voices, or any sign that the shadow by the barn had returned with company. But morning arrived empty. No riders. No sheriff. No second set of tracks in the dust. Only the ordinary sounds of a ranch waking up, the soft clink of tack from the barn, the restless shift of cattle in the far pasture, and the scrape of Noah stirring on the settee behind him. Elias rose before the boy could speak and put coffee on the stove, though he knew Noah would not drink it. He fried the last 2 eggs in the skillet and cut thick slices from a loaf gone a little stale at the edges. When he set the plate on the table, Noah looked at it the same way he had looked at every kindness Elias had offered, with gratitude held carefully in check, as if he had learned early that wanting too much from the world could be dangerous. They ate in silence at first. Then Elias folded his hands on the table and said, "It is first light. Time for the truth you promised." Noah lowered his fork. In the clear light of morning he looked younger than he had at midnight, but not by much. There was still that same watchfulness in his eyes, that same sense that childhood had been shortened for him by forces he did not choose. He reached beneath his shirt again and drew out the small carved piece on the leather cord. In daylight Elias could see it better now. It was not just ornament. It was a marker of some kind, etched with a hawk and a circle pattern so precise it looked ceremonial. Noah turned it once in his fingers before speaking. "My grandfather is Daniel Greyhawk," he said. The name settled into the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Elias had heard it before after all, in half-finished conversations in town, in talk about agreements, grazing lines, and old disputes that men with power kept alive long after decent people had forgotten the reasons. Noah looked up. "Sheriff Mercer thinks my grandfather has something he wants. Papers. Proof. I do not know all of it. I only know Mercer has been trying to force a meeting that would not be honest. When my family understood that, they sent word and moved people out of the way. I was supposed to ride with one of our men to a safe place north of Dry Creek. We were separated." Elias listened without interrupting. "And Mercer is looking for you because?" Noah hesitated. "Because if he cannot reach my grandfather directly, he may try to use fear, or pressure, or the threat of shame. A missing boy can make men do foolish things." Elias stared at the table for a long moment. None of this sounded smaller than Wade had warned. If anything, it sounded worse precisely because Noah was telling only what he believed Elias needed to know. There were still blank spaces in the story, and blank spaces were often where danger hid. He opened his mouth to ask the next question, but the chair across from him was already scraping back. Noah stood, sudden and certain. "I should not have stayed this long," he said. "You have done enough." Elias rose too. "Done enough for what?" But Noah was already stepping away from the table. "For giving me one safe night." The words hit Elias wrong, not because of what they meant, but because of the finality in them. He followed the boy to the porch, but by the time he reached the door, Noah was already crossing the yard toward the south fence line with the quick, determined pace of someone who had made up his mind hours earlier. "Noah," Elias called. The boy stopped once, turned, and for the first time there was no caution in his face, only something like regret. He lifted the carved token from his neck, set it carefully on the porch rail, and said, "If they come before I return, do not tell them I was afraid." Then he slipped through the gap by the cottonwood and disappeared into the pale morning beyond the pasture, leaving Elias alone on the porch with a token in his hand, 1,000 questions in his mind, and the cold certainty that the real storm had not passed in the night. It had only chosen a wider path. Noah had been gone less than 2 hours when the first rider came up the road from town, and by noon there were 4 more. Elias saw them from the yard while he was repairing a loose hinge on the chicken coop, though the truth was he had not done a full morning's work since the boy disappeared past the cottonwood. His hands kept returning to the carved token in his pocket, fingers brushing the smooth edge of it as if the shape itself might explain what kind of promise he had stumbled into. The riders were not ranch hands out on ordinary business. They came in 2s and 3s, slowed as they reached his gate, and looked over the place with the open curiosity of men who believed they were already part of the story. By the time Sheriff Roy Mercer arrived in a cloud of road dust a little after noon, the air around the Turner Ranch felt thinner, tighter, as though every rumor from Medicine Bow had ridden out ahead of him and settled over the yard before his boots ever touched the ground. Mercer dismounted with the confidence of a man used to stepping onto other people's property as though it were an extension of his own authority. He was clean-shaven, broad in the chest, and wore his badge less like a duty than a warning. His hat brim shaded his eyes, but there was no hiding the calculation in them. He nodded once at Elias, not friendly, not unfriendly, just measuring. "Turner," he said. "Sheriff," Elias answered. Mercer's gaze moved past him toward the barn, the corral, the house, every ordinary thing on the ranch suddenly treated like evidence. "I hear you had a visitor." Elias leaned the hammer against the coop and wiped his palms on his trousers. "I hear town has too much time to talk." Mercer did not smile. "This is not talk. A boy was seen headed this direction yesterday. Some say he stopped here." Elias held his ground. "Some say a lot." The sheriff took a few slow steps through the yard, studying the dust as if the earth itself might choose sides. "That boy belongs to a matter bigger than one thirsty child asking for help. He is tied to a dispute that can upset agreements across this whole county if handled poorly." Elias watched him carefully. Mercer had chosen his words well. Not one of them sounded false on the surface, and that was exactly what made them dangerous. "If you are worried about his safety," Elias said, "you can stop circling and say so plain." Mercer turned then, and for the first time something harder showed beneath the polished calm. "Safety is exactly what I am worried about. His grandfather has refused to meet under reasonable terms. Messages have been ignored. Opportunities for peace have been pushed aside. Now the boy is missing, and men on both sides are beginning to take that personally." Elias heard the phrase and did not like it. Both sides. Men used those words when they wanted to make confusion sound fair. "And if he came here?" Elias asked. Mercer looked directly at him. "Then the wise thing would be to tell me where he went." The riders by the fence shifted in their saddles, saying nothing, but their silence only made Mercer's question heavier. Elias thought of Noah standing in the doorway that morning, leaving the carved token on the porch rail and asking only that no one say he had been afraid. He thought of the boot print by the barn, the shadow in the night, the way Mercer's concern never once sounded like kindness. "He was here," Elias said at last, because the truth in pieces sometimes revealed more than a lie in full. "He had water. Food. A place to rest. Then he left after sunrise." Mercer's face gave away almost nothing, but one of the men by the fence muttered something under his breath and the sheriff flicked 2 fingers for silence without taking his eyes off Elias. "Which way?" Mercer asked. Elias shrugged once. "South pasture, then beyond that. Open land after that point." "He was on foot." Mercer let the answer hang. Then he asked, too casually, "Did he leave anything behind?" It was a small question, almost an afterthought, and because it was so small Elias knew it mattered more than all the others. He kept his voice flat. "Just an empty plate." Mercer studied him for a long second, and Elias could feel the whole ranch balanced on that silence. At last the sheriff nodded. "If you remember anything else, you ride into town and tell me before sundown." He turned to mount up, then paused with one boot in the stirrup. "One more thing, Turner. Folks in Medicine Bow are already saying your sympathy may have invited trouble none of us can afford. If riders start crossing this county line in numbers, people will remember where the trail paused first." Then he swung into the saddle and led his men back toward the road, leaving the warning behind like dust that would not settle. Elias stood in the yard long after they disappeared, the sun hard overhead, the token heavy in his pocket, and the sheriff's words working their way through him. It was no longer only Noah who was being hunted by rumor. Now the whole county had begun to place Elias Turner inside the shape of the problem, and once a town decided you were part of its fear, it became very hard to stand anywhere that still felt like home. The next morning arrived with the kind of brightness that made everything look too exposed. Elias had barely finished feeding the stock when he noticed the first line of dust on the southern horizon. At a distance it was only a pale smear against the sky, low and wide, the sort of thing a man might mistake for wind moving across dry country if he had a mind to lie to himself. But Elias had lived too long on that land to misread it. Dust moved one way when weather drove it. It moved another when horses did. He set the feed bucket down and stood still, watching the horizon as the line thickened and climbed. By mid-morning, the smear had become a wall, not tall, but broad enough to swallow the break between earth and sky. "He's gelding in there." Corral lifted its head and gave a restless snort. The cattle in the far lot began drifting toward the fence in uneasy clusters. Even the chickens seemed quieter, staying close to the shade as if the whole ranch could feel something coming long before the human eye could name it. Elias stepped onto the porch and narrowed his eyes into the glare. There were riders in that dust now. Too many to count cleanly from this distance, but enough to make the heart of any lonely man pull tight. His first thought was not of himself. It was of Noah, somewhere beyond the pasture lines, out on open country with miles of dry land in every direction. His second thought came harder. Mercer had said people would remember where the trail paused first if riders crossed the county line in numbers. Well, the numbers were here now. It did not take long for the news to travel. Before noon, Elias saw two wagons stopped on the road half a mile off, townspeople standing in the beds to get a better look at the southern plain. Another pair of riders held back near his front gate, not coming in, not offering help, just watching as if his ranch had turned into a stage for trouble they were grateful was not happening in their own yard. By noon the dust cloud had spread so wide it cast a faint haze over the day, and individual shapes began to separate from it. Horsemen. Row after row of them. A mounted column moving with discipline instead of panic, steady and direct, crossing the land with the kind of purpose Elias had only seen a few times in his life. He felt a cold pressure settle under his ribs. This was no search party thrown together by rumor. This was an answer. The question was to whom? Another rider came hard from town around midday, and this time it was Wade Collins again, hatless and sweating, reining in so sharply near the porch that his team stamped and tossed their heads. They counted at least 200, Wade said before he even climbed down. Then he looked back at the horizon and corrected himself in a lower voice. No. More than that now. Elias kept his gaze on the riders. Mercer knows. Mercer has half the town in a fever, Wade said. He says everybody should stay clear of this road. Says nobody is to interfere. Says this proves exactly what he warned about. Elias almost laughed at the neatness of that. A man stirs fear, then claims wisdom when fear shows up wearing dust. Did he say who they are? Wade swallowed. People are saying Greyhawk men. People are saying the whole matter has turned bad. Elias said nothing. The carved token sat in his pocket, smooth and solid against his palm. He had taken it out 3 times that morning and put it back every time, as though merely holding it in the open might pull whatever was coming that final last mile. Wade stepped onto the porch beside him and lowered his voice. Eli, if they stop here, you ought to come with me to town. Let Mercer handle this. Elias turned slowly to look at him. And leave my place now. Wade did not answer. He did not need to. Both men knew what town would call that if Elias rode away while 300 mounted men approached his ranch. Guilt. Fear. Admission. No, if this day meant to break over Elias Turner's life, it would do it with him standing on his own boards beneath his own roof. He looked back to the plain. The leading riders were clear now, sunlight touching bridle leather and hat brims, horses moving in one long breathing line across the earth. There were more than 300. He knew that now. Enough to make the ground seem to pulse beneath the porch posts. Enough to make every warning Wade had carried from town feel suddenly too small. And yet, strange as it was, the closer the riders came, the less Elias felt panic and the more he felt certainty. Something had been set in motion the moment Noah Greyhawk lifted that first tin cup to his lips. Everything since then had only been distance closing. Wade backed down the steps at last, unable to stand still any longer. I am telling you, this is bigger than one ranch. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. That much I know. Then, as the front of the mounted column rose out of the thinning dust and the first bannerless line of riders took full shape against the noon light, Elias Turner saw something that made his breath catch for the first time all day. Near the front, riding not behind the others but beside them, was a smaller figure on a dark horse, sitting straight, steady, and unmistakable even from a distance. Noah had returned. And he had not come back alone. The mounted column slowed as it neared the Turner ranch, and for one long breath the only sound was the drumming of hooves against dry Wyoming earth and the whisper of wind pushing dust around the porch posts. Elias stood at the top step with his hat in one hand and his other hand resting at his side, not in surrender, not in challenge, simply planted in the truth of his own ground. Wade Collins had already backed his wagon away from the yard, retreating to a safer distance on the road, and the handful of townspeople who had gathered there went silent as the riders spread across the southern edge of the property in a broad half-circle. There were more of them up close than Elias had guessed from afar, men riding with disciplined calm, their horses well kept, their faces unreadable from beneath hat brims and the bright wash of noon. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. That silence, more than anything, made the whole sight feel larger than threat. It felt deliberate. Noah rode near the front on a dark bay horse that moved like it had been trained by careful hands. The boy who had crossed Elias's pasture on foot with dust in his boots looked different now, not because he had become someone new, but because the truth of who he had always been had finally caught up to him. His shoulders were squared. His chin was lifted. His shirt had been changed for a darker one with clean stitching at the collar, and the uncertainty Elias had glimpsed in him by lamplight was gone. In its place was something steady and inherited. Beside him rode an older man with silver at his temples, straight-backed and self-possessed, wearing authority as naturally as other men wore their coats. He did not need a badge. He did not need a crowd to announce him. Elias knew at once this was Daniel Greyhawk. The column stopped 30 yards from the porch. Dust drifted past the horse's legs, thinning slowly in the heat. Then Noah nudged his horse forward 2 steps, and the older man came with him. Wade, still out by the road, made a strained sound that might have been a warning, but nobody paid him any mind. Noah looked directly at Elias, and for the first time since leaving that morning, the boy allowed real feeling into his face. I told them, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, that you gave me water before you asked my name. Elias felt the weight of every eye on him, from the riders, from the road, from the town that had already decided what this day must mean. He answered the way he knew how. A thirsty boy does not need an introduction first. For the first time, a faint change touched Daniel Greyhawk's expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough to warmth that the men nearest him seemed to ease with it. He brought his horse one length farther forward and spoke in a low, even voice that somehow carried farther than Mercer's ever had. Then your house has more honor in it than many halls where men claim to speak of peace. The words landed over the yard like rain on dust. Elias heard the shift that passed through the townspeople on the road. Confusion first. Then disbelief. This was not the arrival they had prepared their fear for. Daniel Greyhawk inclined his head once, not as a subject, not as a superior, but as one man recognizing another. My grandson reached your land tired, alone, and uncertain whom he could trust. You gave him water, food, and shelter. You protected him when you did not know who watched from the dark. We came because such a debt is not forgotten in my family." Elias glanced at Noah, then back at Daniel. "Folks in town thought you were coming for something else." Noah's eyes flickered toward the road where Wade stood beside his wagon and others stared from behind him. "That was what Sheriff Mercer wanted them to think," the boy said. Elias felt the name move through the gathered air like a shadow passing over sun. Daniel Greyhawk's face hardened, not with anger that needed display, but with the settled gravity of a man who had waited too long to speak plainly. "Roy Mercer has spent months trying to force an advantage by stirring fear between neighbors," he said. "He wants rights to water access and grazing routes he cannot claim honestly. He hoped to create panic, then present himself as the man who could contain it. When Noah was separated from our escort, Mercer saw opportunity. A missing child can be turned into rumor. Rumor can be turned into pressure. Pressure can make desperate men sign away what should never have been demanded." Elias looked past Daniel toward the long line of riders behind him and understood at last what this gathering truly was. Not a raid. Not a threat. A witness. A statement too large to ignore. Noah reached into his shirt and held up the leather cord that had once carried the carved token now sitting in Elias's pocket. "I left the marker with you because I knew they would come if I returned." His voice softened. "I just did not know if I would make it back in time to explain." For one suspended moment, nobody on the road or in the yard seemed to know what to do with the truth now standing in front of them. Fear had prepared them for vengeance. Instead, they were looking at gratitude backed by 300 mounted men. Daniel Greyhawk turned his horse slightly, enough to face not only Elias but the watchers on the road beyond the fence. "We did not ride here for revenge," he said. "We rode here because a man living alone on dry land chose decency when it cost him comfort. Men like that should not stand alone when lies begin to gather." And as those words settled over the Turner Ranch, Elias realized the day had turned in a way no one in Medicine Bow had imagined. The riders had not come because he was the problem. They had come because, in a place where nearly everyone had chosen suspicion, Elias Turner had become the one man worth standing beside. Elias had spent the last 2 days bracing himself for blame, suspicion, and the slow closing of every familiar door in Medicine Bow. He had not prepared for gratitude to arrive on horseback and settle over his yard like something almost sacred. For a moment he simply stood there, hat in hand, while the truth rearranged itself around him. The boy he had fed at his kitchen table was not some nameless trouble wandering the prairie. He was Noah Greyhawk, grandson of Daniel Greyhawk, and the 300 riders fanned out across the southern edge of the Turner Ranch had come not to punish kindness, but to answer it. Yet even as that realization steadied him, Elias could feel the tension on the road beyond his fence. The townspeople had not come all this way to watch fear turn into respect. They were still holding on to the story Sheriff Mercer had sold them, and stories do not let go easily once pride begins defending them. Daniel Greyhawk seemed to know that without being told. He turned in the saddle and lifted one hand, not high, not like a commander making a spectacle, just enough for the nearest riders to shift and open a narrow path through the front rank. 2 men rode forward carrying something long and wrapped in canvas across their saddles. Behind them came a 3rd horse loaded with water skins and tied bundles. The men dismounted near the fence and set the wrapped item carefully on the ground before stepping back. Daniel looked to Elias. "You said your land has been dry." It was not really a question, but Elias nodded anyway. Daniel continued, "Mercer has been pressing claims near the creek line west of here. He hoped to force smaller ranchers into dependency when the late summer runs low. He assumed isolated men could be squeezed one at a time." Elias felt the truth of that settle in him at once. Mercer had asked too many casual questions over the past year about runoff, fencing, and whose well still held in August. At the time it had seemed like ordinary county business. Now it looked like measuring weak points. Noah guided his horse closer to the porch and spoke quietly, but with the same calm certainty Elias had first noticed when the boy was drinking water in the shade. My grandfather brought witnesses, maps, and the men who know the older boundary agreements by memory. Mercer wanted pressure because he did not have honesty on his side. One of the men near the canvas bundle knelt and untied the straps. When he pulled the cloth back, Elias saw a rolled survey map case, a wooden box of documents sealed in oilskin, and a set of brass measuring tools that caught the noon light. Not treasure in the way stories usually mean it, but something far more dangerous to a dishonest man. Proof. Daniel Greyhawk's gaze shifted past Elias too. The townspeople and riders gathered along the road. Before sunset, he said, "We will go to Medicine Bow with these records and with every witness needed to speak plainly in public." Roy Mercer has relied on private fear, private pressure, and private threats. Today the matter becomes public truth. A murmur passed through the onlookers. Elias could almost hear the exact moment uncertainty began replacing certainty in their minds. No one liked to discover that the man who claimed to protect order had actually been feeding confusion for his own gain. Wade Collins, still near his wagon, took off his hat and ran a hand over his hair as if trying to wake himself from a misunderstanding that had gone too far. Elias looked at the water skins, then at the box of papers, then at Noah. "You brought all this here first?" Noah nodded. "Because he expected Mercer would come to town, not to your ranch, if he thought fear was working. And because you deserved to hear the truth before anybody used your name again." The simplicity of that struck Elias harder than any speech could have. For 2 days his ranch had been treated like the place where trouble paused. Now, because of one decision made in summer heat beside a barrel of water, it had become the place where lies were forced into daylight. Daniel lifted his chin slightly toward the corral. "There is more. The men who rode with Noah checked the line east of your pasture this morning. Someone moved marker stones near the creek fork within the last month. That land loss would have cut your access by nearly a quarter mile come late season." Elias stared at him. A quarter mile of water access was not a detail. On this land, it was the difference between a hard year and a ruined one. He turned and looked toward the west as if the ground itself might confess. Mercer had not just been chasing a boy. He had been circling every vulnerable man in the county, preparing to tighten the noose with paperwork, rumor, and the kind of official language most decent people were too tired to challenge. Noah dismounted then and stepped onto the dirt of the yard, no longer the child who had arrived half faint with dust on his face, but not entirely separate from him either. He came up the porch steps and stopped in front of Elias. "You asked me for enough truth to decide what came next," he said. "I did not give enough then." Elias reached into his pocket, pulled out the carved token, and placed it in Noah's hand. "You gave what you could." Noah closed his fingers around it and looked up. "Then let me give the rest now." Mercer thought if he could frighten enough people, they would stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing each other as threats. That is how he meant to win. Daniel's voice came from just beyond the steps, deep and steady as worn timber. "And that is why we came here first. Not to save ourselves. To make sure he could not isolate the man who refused to act out of fear." Elias looked out over the 300 riders, over Wade Collins by the road, over the townspeople whose faces no longer matched the story they had brought with them, and he understood at last that the debt being repaid was larger than food, water, or shelter. What stood in his yard now was not just gratitude. It was protection. It was witness. It was the full weight of a promise that decency would not be left standing by itself while dishonesty tried to own the county. And somewhere in the distance, back toward Medicine Bow, Elias could already feel the shape of the next hour forming, because when public truth starts riding toward a town that has been fed lies, somebody always realizes too late that the real danger was never the riders on the horizon. It was the man who had counted on no one bringing the truth with them. By the time the sun began its slow drop toward the western ridge, the road to Medicine Bow no longer belonged to rumor. It belonged to witnesses. Daniel Greyhawk rode at the front with Noah beside him, Elias just off their left, and behind them came the long-measured line of riders that had turned fear into silence all across the county. No one charged ahead. No one shouted. They did not need to. Truth has a different kind of weight when it travels in full view of everyone who once doubted it. By the time they reached town, people had already gathered along the boardwalks, in doorways, and near the stock trough. By the general store. Men who had spent the morning repeating Sheriff Mercer's warnings now stood with their hats in their hands and their certainty gone from their faces. Women leaned forward from shaded porches, children peered around wagon wheels, and every eye followed the survey case, the oilskin documents, and the men who carried them as though the whole town could feel that something larger than a dispute had arrived. Mercer came out of the courthouse with his jaw set and his shoulders square, still wearing the look of a man who believed authority alone might hold back what was coming. But that look changed when he saw not only Daniel Greyhawk and Elias Turner, but Wade Collins too, climbing down from his wagon and taking a place where all could see him. Wade had spent enough hours inside his own fear. Now he stood with the uneasy dignity of a man trying at last to stand inside the truth. Daniel did not waste words. In front of the town, with maps unrolled across a table borrowed from the mercantile and witnesses called by name, he laid out the old boundary lines, the water access agreements, the moved marker stones, and the pressure Mercer had been applying in private to men he thought too isolated to resist. One by one, the pieces fit. Ranchers who had been told they must sign new arrangements admitted they had been rushed. Others recognized the altered measurements and the missing references to older records. Even men who had no love for Greyhawk could not deny what was sitting in plain sight before them. Mercer tried to speak over it at first, tried to wrap himself in talk of stability and county order, but every answer he gave only sounded thinner than the one before. By late afternoon, the story he had built for months had collapsed under the weight of details he could not explain away. Elias said very little through all of it. He stood there in his worn hat and dusted boots, not as a hero, not as a politician, not as a man eager to be seen, but simply as the rancher who had offered water before he knew the value the world would place on it. More than once he caught townspeople looking at him with a kind of uncertainty that bordered on shame. They had expected him to be the weak link in the chain, the lonely man on dry land who would fold under pressure and distance. Instead, by doing the smallest decent thing, he had become the place where the whole lie finally broke apart. When the gathering ended and the crowd slowly began to thin, Noah crossed the street and stopped beside him. The evening light had gone soft by then, turning the dust gold around their boots. For the first time since Elias met him, Noah looked entirely like what he was meant to be, still young, still carrying more than a boy should have to carry, but no longer alone inside it. He held out the carved token once more. Elias looked at it, then at Noah. "Keep it," he said. "A man ought to hold on to the things that brought him home." Noah smiled then, small and real. "It brought me to your porch first." Daniel Greyhawk stepped up beside them, his expression steady but warmer than before. "And because it did, there are people in this county who will sleep easier this season than they would have otherwise." He glanced toward the west, where the last light was stretching long across the road out of town. "The land remembers what men do on it. So do families." It was not a grand speech, and that was why Elias believed every word of it. In the days that followed, things changed in ways both visible and quiet. The marker stones were set right. The creek line west of Elias's land was measured again in open daylight. Men who had once kept their distance from the Turner Ranch began stopping by the gate with practical reasons that did not always hide their respect. Wade Collins came over one morning with fence staples and no speech prepared, which somehow meant more than any apology. And when late summer tightened its grip on the county, a wagon from Greyhawk land arrived with water barrels and a note written in a careful hand that simply said, "A debt is not forgotten." But the biggest change did not show itself in town records or fence lines. It showed itself at dusk, when Elias would stand on his porch looking over the same 40 acres of hard land and realize the silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt earned. He was still a man of few words. The roof still sagged. The barn still leaned. The well still had to be watched by the bucket. Yet the loneliness that had once settled over everything like dust had lifted just enough for something else to breathe underneath it. Respect. Connection. The knowledge that one decent act, done with no audience and no promise of reward, had reached farther than fear ever could. Some evenings, if the light hit the pasture just right, Elias could still picture a tired boy standing beside the barn, asking for water in a voice that tried not to ask for too much. And every time he remembered that moment, he understood the same truth a little more clearly. On the frontier, people talked endlessly about strength as if it lived in rifles, fences, and hard winters survived. But sometimes strength began in a smaller place. Sometimes it began when one person looked at another in need and chose not suspicion, not calculation, not self-protection, but simple mercy. That was the thing Sheriff Mercer had never understood. Fear can gather a crowd, and lies can move fast across dry country, but neither one can stand for long against the memory of a good act that arrived exactly when it was needed. And on the Turner Ranch, where the dust still rose, the cattle still wandered, and the wind still wrote its old songs across the plain, Elias Turner lived out the rest of that season with a steadier heart, knowing that on the hardest land he had ever known, the one thing that had finally changed everything was not power. It was kindness.